Rodriguez about the family section arrangements. General seating. The words hit me like a physical blow. At my own daughter's wedding, I was listed the same as distant cousins and college friends. I watched Sarah walk toward the house, her heels clicking on the stone pathway, and felt that familiar tightness in my chest that I'd learned to associate with any interaction involving Margaret Rodriguez. When Sarah returned, her smile was apologetic but firm. Mrs. Rodriguez explained that due to the layout of the ceremony space, immediate family seating is quite limited. She's reserved the front row for parents and grandparents, but there are only 8 seats total. Since Mr. Rodriguez's parents will be attending along with both sets of parents, the seating is completely full. The math didn't work, and we both knew it. David's grandparents, Margaret and Robert, Tony and his new wife, Emma and David. That was 6 people, not 8. But challenging the arrangement would mean making a scene, and Margaret was counting on my reluctance to do that. She knew I wouldn't risk embarrassing Emma on her wedding day, even if it meant swallowing my own humiliation. "Where will I be sitting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah consulted her clipboard again. "Row 4, seat 12. It's actually a lovely spot with a great view of the ceremony. Row 4. Behind the extended family, behind the close friends, behind people who had known Emma for months while I had known her for 24 years. I nodded and thanked Sarah, then walked toward the gardens to collect myself before anyone could see the tears threatening to spill over. The rose garden was quiet except for the sound of bees moving between blossoms and the distant chatter of vendors setting up tables. I found a bench hidden behind a trellis of climbing roses and sat down, trying to process what had just happened. This was Emma's day, I reminded myself. My feelings didn't matter as much as her happiness. If sitting in row 4 meant avoiding conflict that might upset her, then that's what I would do. But the hurt ran deeper than just seating arrangements. Margaret's message was clear. I didn't belong in the front row of my own daughter's life. Despite everything I had sacrificed, every extra shift I had worked, every dream I had deferred to give Emma opportunities I never had, I was still just general seating in the eyes of her new family. I thought about calling Grace, but she was probably getting ready at the hotel, and I didn't want to burden her with my problems. I thought about calling in sick, claiming a sudden migraine, but Emma would never forgive me for missing her wedding. So I sat in that garden, surrounded by the scent of roses and the sound of my own heartbeat, and tried to find the strength to walk back to that venue and smile through the next 6 hours. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting in the most beautiful place I'd ever seen, at what should have been one of the happiest moments of my life, feeling more alone and insignificant than I had in years. Margaret had managed to diminish me without saying a single harsh word, using logistics and tradition to put me in my place as effectively as any direct insult could have. When I finally stood up to head back to the main building, I caught sight of Jake Thompson directing some of the catering staff near the reception area. He was younger than I'd expected for a venue manager, probably in his early 30s, with an easy smile and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you're good at your job. He noticed me walking back from the garden and approached with what seemed like genuine concern. "Everything all right, ma'am? You looked like you might need a quiet moment." His kindness almost undid me completely. "Just taking in how beautiful everything is," I managed to say. "My daughter's getting married here today." "Emma Chen?" When I nodded, his smile widened. "She's lovely. You must be so proud." "I am," I said, and meant it completely despite everything else I was feeling. Jake studied my face for a moment, and I wondered if my emotional state was more obvious than I'd hoped. "If you need anything at all today, please don't hesitate to find me. We want this to be perfect for Emma's family. Emma's family." The phrase should have included me without question, but after the morning's seating revelation, I wasn't sure it did. Still, Jake's warmth was exactly what I needed in that moment. a reminder that not everyone saw me as an afterthought. I spent the next hour helping where I could, though Margaret had made it clear that everything was under control and additional help wasn't needed. I arranged programs that were already perfectly arranged, straightened chairs that were already straight, and tried to stay busy enough that I wouldn't have time to think about where I'd be sitting or what that meant about my place in Emma's new life. When Emma arrived with her bridesmaids, she looked absolutely radiant. The dress we'd chosen together hung perfectly on her slight frame, and the hairstylist had created an elegant updo that showcased the pearl earrings that had been my mother's. For a moment, watching her laugh with her friends while the photographer captured candid shots, I forgot about everything else. This was my daughter, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep and cheered at soccer games and helped with homework at, this same kitchen table where I'd had my coffee that morning. "Mom!" Emma rushed over when she saw me, careful to hold up her dress as she navigated the stone pathway. "You look beautiful. That color is perfect on you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She hugged me carefully, mindful of her makeup and hair, and I breathed in the scent of her perfume mixed with hairspray and that indefinable smell that had been uniquely Emma since she was born. "You look like a princess," I told her, and watched her eyes fill with the same tears I was fighting back. "Don't make me cry," she laughed, fanning her face with her hands. It took them an hour to do this makeup. Margaret appeared beside us as if materialized from thin air, resplendent, in a champagne-colored mother-of-the-groom dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She looked Emma up and down with approval before turning to me with that familiar, practiced smile. "Lisa, don't you look nice?" she said, though something in her tone suggested she'd found fault with my appearance. "I hope you don't mind, but..." I had Sarah make a small adjustment to the seating chart. Family dynamics can be so complicated at weddings. Emma looked between us, clearly sensing tension but not understanding its source. "What kind of adjustment?" "Just logistics, darling," Margaret said smoothly, "making sure everyone has the best possible view of your special moment." I could have spoken up then. I could have asked Emma directly about the seating arrangements, forced Margaret to explain in front of the bride why the mother of the bride was relegated to row 4. But Emma looked so happy, so excited, so completely focused on the joy of the day that I couldn't bring myself to introduce conflict into her perfect moment. "That's thoughtful of you," I said instead, hating myself for the words even as they left my mouth. Margaret's smile turned triumphant just for a second before returning to its practiced warmth. She knew she'd won this round, and she knew I knew it too. The photographer called for family pictures, and I found myself positioned at the edge of every shot, as if I might disappear from the frame entirely if the camera angle shifted slightly. Margaret orchestrated the poses with military precision, ensuring that she and Robert were prominently featured while I remained peripheral. When Tony arrived with his new wife Jennifer, even they were given more central positioning than I was, despite the fact that Tony had missed more of Emma's childhood milestones than he'd attended. As guests began arriving and taking their seats, I realized I would need to find my assigned spot soon. Row 4, seat 12 felt like a prison sentence, but I couldn't delay any longer without making my absence obvious. I gave Emma one more hug, told her I loved her, and walked toward the ceremony area with as much dignity as I could muster. The venue was filling up quickly, and I could see the clear hierarchy in the seating arrangement. The front row gleamed, with the Rodriguez family patriarch and matriarch, Margaret and Robert, looking like royalty holding court. Tony and Jennifer sat beside them, Tony fidgeting with his tie and looking uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo. The second row held David's extended family members, people I'd met briefly at the engagement party and whose names I couldn't remember. The third row was filled with close friends of both families, people who'd been invited to engagement parties and shower events that I'd somehow been overlooked for. And then there was row 4, where I sat beside strangers who were probably David's college friends or distant relatives. The woman next to me was pleasant enough, making small talk about the beautiful venue and the perfect weather, but I could barely focus on her words. All I could think about was how I'd gotten here, how the mother of the bride had become an afterthought at her own daughter's wedding. When the music started for the processional, I stood with everyone else and watched Emma make her entrance, on Tony's arm. She was luminous, absolutely glowing with happiness. And for those few minutes as she walked down the aisle, nothing else mattered. Not the seating arrangements, not Margaret's subtle cruelty, not my own hurt feelings. This was Emma's moment, and she deserved to have it be perfect. But as Father Michael O'Brien began the ceremony and I strained to see over the heads of the people in front of me, I couldn't help but think about all the sacrifices that had led to this day, and how invisible they seemed to be to everyone except me. The ceremony itself was beautiful, though I found myself fighting back tears that had nothing to do with joy. Emma and David exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to support each other's dreams and build a life filled with love and adventure. David's voice cracked slightly when he promised to cherish Emma for all of his days, and I could see genuine emotion in his eyes. Whatever I thought of his family, there was no doubt that he truly loved my daughter. But even during those precious moments, I was acutely aware of my position in the back, watching my daughter's wedding like a distant observer, rather than an integral part of the celebration. Margaret sat in the front row with perfect posture, dabbing delicately at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, every inch the proud mother-in-law. She had positioned herself perfectly for the photographer, ensuring that every candid shot of the ceremony would capture her emotional investment in the moment. When Father O'Brien pronounced Emma and David husband and wife, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. I clapped enthusiastically, standing on my tiptoes to catch a glimpse of Emma's radiant smile as she kissed her new husband. The photographer moved efficiently through the crowd, capturing the joy of family members in the front rows, while I remained largely out of frame, another face in the general population of well-wishers. As the newlyweds made their way back down the aisle, Emma's eyes searched the crowd until they found mine. Her smile widened even further, and she gave me a little wave that made my heart soar despite everything else. In that moment, she was still my little girl, still making sure her mom felt included in her special day. I waved back, putting every ounce of love and pride I felt into that simple gesture. The cocktail hour that followed was held on the main lawn of Grandview Estate, with servers circulating among guests offering champagne and elaborate hors d'oeuvres. I accepted a glass of champagne and tried to mingle, but most conversations seemed to naturally exclude me. The Rodriguez family had their own social circle, people from their law practice and country club who all seemed to know each other well. My small contingent of guests clustered together somewhat awkwardly, clearly feeling as out of place as I did in this elegant setting. Grace found me standing near the edge of the lawn, looking out over the valley view that stretched for miles below us. My sister had flown in from Seattle specifically for the wedding, taking time off from her job as a high school counselor and spending money she didn't really have on the plane ticket and hotel room. She looked lovely in the burgundy dress we'd found together during one of her visits, but I could see the same discomfort in her posture that I felt. "This place is incredible," she said, joining me at the stone balustrade that overlooked the gardens. "Emma must feel like a princess." "She does," I agreed, watching as Emma posed for photos with David's extended family near the rose garden where I'd had my moment of crisis earlier. "She deserves to feel like a princess." Grace studied my face with the perception that comes from 30 years of sisterhood. "But you're not having a good time." I considered deflecting, making some excuse about being tired or overwhelmed by the day's emotions. But Grace had always been my closest confidant, the one person who understood the struggles of our childhood and the weight of raising Emma, alone. If I couldn't be honest with her, I couldn't be honest with anyone. Margaret Rodriguez has made it very clear that I don't belong in her son's life, I said quietly, mindful of the other guests nearby. I'm sitting in row 4 at my own daughter's wedding, Grace. Row 4. My sister's eyes widened with indignation. What do you mean, row 4? You're the mother of the bride. I explained the seating situation, the gradual exclusion from wedding, planning decisions, the subtle ways Margaret had managed to minimize my role in the day's events. Grace listened with growing anger, her counselor's training helping her recognize the psychological manipulation tactics that I'd been too close to the situation to fully identify. This is deliberate, Grace said when I finished. She's trying to establish dominance, to make sure you know your place in the family hierarchy before they're even officially family. I know that, I replied, but what can I do about it? If I make a scene, I ruin Emma's day. If I confront Margaret directly, I become the difficult ex-wife who can't handle not being the center of attention. There's no winning move here. Grace was quiet for a moment, watching as Margaret orchestrated another round of family photos, this time with Emma and David surrounded by what appeared to be every Rodriguez relative in attendance. I wasn't invited to join this group either, despite being immediate family to half of the couple being celebrated. Maybe the winning move isn't about confronting her, Grace said thoughtfully. Maybe it's about not letting her define your worth. Before I could ask what she meant, Jake Thompson appeared beside us with a warm smile and 2 fresh glasses of champagne. He'd changed from his earlier casual attire into a sharp black suit that transformed him from venue employee to someone who looked like he belonged among the wedding guests. Ladies, you both look like you could use a refresh, he said, offering us the champagne. And Mrs. Chen, I wanted to let you know that your daughter specifically asked me to make sure you were taken care of today. She's very worried that you might not be enjoying yourself. The fact that Emma had noticed my discomfort and taken steps to address it made my chest tight with emotion. Even on her wedding day, she was thinking about my well-being, trying to ensure I felt valued and included. She's always been thoughtful like that, I managed to say. Even as a little girl, she worried about other people's feelings. She gets that from somewhere, Jake said with a knowing look. I've been working weddings for 8 years, and I can usually tell within the first hour which families genuinely care about each other and which ones are just going through the motions. Your daughter talks about you the way people talk about their heroes. His words were like a balm to my wounded spirit. Despite Margaret's attempts to diminish my importance, Emma still saw me as essential to her story. That had to count for something. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. Jake excused himself to check on the dinner preparations, but not before mentioning that he'd personally ensured my table assignment for dinner would give me a perfect view of the head table. It was a small kindness, but it felt significant after a day of small cruelties. As the cocktail hour wound down and guests began moving toward the reception hall, I caught sight of Emma searching the crowd with slightly frantic eyes. When she spotted me, relief flooded her features, and she hurried over as quickly as her dress would allow. Mom, there you are. I've been looking everywhere for you. She reached for my hands, her wedding ring catching the late afternoon sunlight. Are you having a good time? You seem a little quiet. I'm having a wonderful time, I lied smoothly. Everything is absolutely perfect, sweetheart. You look radiant. Emma studied my face with the same perceptive expression Grace had worn earlier. Are you sure? Margaret mentioned that there might have been some confusion about seating arrangements, and I wanted to make sure you weren't upset about anything. The fact that Margaret had brought up the seating issue with Emma made my blood boil. She was positioning herself as the reasonable one, the person trying to smooth over difficulties that I was supposedly creating. It was masterfully manipulative, and I could see how easily Emma might be convinced that any problems were the result of my sensitivity rather than Margaret's deliberate exclusion. There's no confusion, I said carefully. Everything is exactly as it should be. Emma didn't look entirely convinced, but before she could probe further, David appeared at her side with Margaret close behind. Margaret's smile was particularly bright as she approached, the look of someone who had just scored a significant victory. "Lisa, I hope you're enjoying the celebration," Margaret said with false warmth. "I know it can be overwhelming when families come together like this. So, many new dynamics to navigate." Her choice of words was deliberate. By referring to new dynamics, she was subtly reminding everyone present that I was the outsider, the one who would need to adjust to their established family structure, rather than being welcomed into it, as an equal. "It's a beautiful celebration," I replied evenly. "You've done a wonderful job organizing everything." "Well, I've had a lot of practice with family events," Margaret said with a light laugh that somehow managed to sound condescending. "When you've been hosting gatherings for as long as I have, you learn how to manage all the moving pieces. It's quite an art, really." The implication was clear. I was one of the moving pieces that required management, not a partner in creating this celebration. Emma looked uncomfortable with the undercurrent of tension, though she might not have been able to identify exactly what felt wrong about the exchange. "We should probably head into dinner," David interjected, perhaps sensing his new wife's discomfort. "The photographer wants to get some shots of us entering the reception hall." As they walked away, Emma turned back to give me another wave, her expression still slightly worried. I forced my brightest smile and gave her an enthusiastic thumbs up, determined not to let my personal drama cast any shadow over her happiness. The reception hall had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Dozens of round tables were draped in ivory linens and adorned with centerpieces of white roses and greenery. String lights hung from the ceiling like stars, and the head table was positioned on a small platform that would give Emma and David a clear view of all their guests. It was exactly the kind of elegant celebration Emma had dreamed of, and I felt a surge of gratitude that she was getting to experience this kind of beauty on her wedding day, regardless of the politics surrounding it. I found my assigned table and was pleasantly surprised to discover that Jake had been true to his word. Table 12 was positioned with a perfect sightline to the head table, and my table mates included Grace, Uncle Frank, and several of my colleagues from the hospital, who had known Emma since she was a teenager. It felt like a small oasis of genuine warmth in a sea of social maneuvering. Dr. Patricia Wells, who had been my supervisor when I first started at Riverside General, leaned over as I sat down. "Lisa, this place is absolutely stunning. Emma must be over the moon." "She is," I confirmed. "She's been dreaming of a wedding like this since she was little." "You should be so proud," added Maria Santos, one of the other nurses. "Raising a daughter like Emma on your own, putting her through college, and now look at her. She's absolutely glowing." Their genuine admiration for Emma and acknowledgement of my role in raising her felt like a lifeline. These were people who had seen me at my most exhausted after double shifts, who had covered for me when Emma was sick and I needed to leave work early, who understood the sacrifices single motherhood required. Their presence reminded me that I had value and worth beyond what Margaret Rodriguez thought of me. The dinner service began with a precision that spoke to the venue's reputation and Margaret's attention to detail. Each course was more elaborate than the last, from the locally sourced salad with edible flowers to the herb-crusted salmon that melted in your mouth. The wine pairings were perfect, and even the bread service involved artisanal rolls that were clearly from some upscale bakery, rather than mass-produced dinner rolls. Between courses, there were toasts and speeches that celebrated Emma and David's love story. David's best man told funny stories about their college friendship, while Emma's maid of honor shared memories of their sorority days and how Emma had always talked about finding someone who would love her unconditionally. Margaret gave a gracious, "Welcome to the family" speech that managed to mention Emma's wonderful qualities without once acknowledging where those qualities might have come from. When Tony stood up to speak as Emma's father, I held my breath. Tony wasn't known for his public speaking skills, and alcohol had a tendency to make him either overly sentimental or inappropriately honest. But his speech was actually quite touching, focusing on his pride in the woman Emma had become and his gratitude to David for making her so happy. He managed to get through it without embarrassing anyone, though I noticed he kept his remarks carefully generic, avoiding any specific memories that might highlight his absence during much of Emma's childhood. As the evening progressed and the dance floor filled with couples swaying to romantic music, I found myself feeling increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by people. The Rodriguez family had claimed a large section of the dance floor, with Margaret holding court among her social circle, while Robert danced with various female relatives. Emma and David moved between tables, greeting guests and posing for photos, but their route seemed to naturally bypass my table more often than others. I excused myself to use the restroom, needing a few minutes away from the celebration to collect my thoughts and reinforce my resolve to make it through the rest of the eye. Evening with Grace. The ladies' room was thankfully empty, giving me a moment of privacy to touch up my makeup and take some deep breaths. When I emerged, I nearly collided with Margaret, who was entering as I was leaving. For a moment, we stood face to face in the narrow hallway outside the restrooms, away from the crowds and the need to maintain public facades. "Lisa," she said, her voice lacking its usual artificial warmth. "I think we should have a little chat." My heart rate immediately increased, but I kept my expression neutral. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Margaret glanced around to ensure we were alone, then fixed me with a direct stare that was far more honest than any look she'd given me all day. "I want to make sure we understand each other," she said quietly. "Emma is part of our family now, and David's happiness is my priority. I don't want there to be any confusion about how things work going forward." "I'm not sure what you mean," I replied, though I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly what she meant. "I mean that Emma has a new life now, with new opportunities and new social circles. It would be unfortunate if old habits or expectations interfered with her ability to embrace those opportunities fully." The words were carefully chosen, but the message was unmistakable. Margaret was essentially telling me that my presence in Emma's life was now conditional, subject to her approval, and dependent on my willingness to accept a diminished role. "Emma will always be my daughter," I said firmly. "Nothing about a wedding changes that." "Chen, did your family know you owned this place?" "No," I said faintly. "I didn't know I owned this place." Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "Well," he said, "this should make for an interesting evening." I stood in that quiet corner of the lobby, staring at Jake Thompson as if he had just told me I'd won the lottery. The legal documents in his hands felt surreal, like props from someone else's life story. My mind struggled to process the information while my heart hammered against my ribs with such force I was certain he could hear it. "I need to sit down," I managed to say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. Jake immediately guided me to one of the elegant upholstered chairs that dotted the lobby area. The music and laughter from the reception felt distant, muffled by the ringing in my ears as I tried to make sense of what was happening. "Mrs. Chen, I know this is overwhelming," Jake said gently, settling into the chair across from me. "But I need to ask, do you have any idea who might have arranged this trust? The legal work was extremely sophisticated, and the financial transactions were substantial. Someone went to great lengths to ensure your ownership while keeping it confidential." I shook my head slowly, my thoughts racing through possibilities. My parents had died years ago, leaving behind more debt than assets. My ex-husband Tony barely managed his own finances, let alone having the resources for property investments. Grace was comfortable but not wealthy. Uncle Frank lived on Social Security. There was literally no one in my life who had the means or inclination to purchase a multi-million-dollar estate on my behalf. "There has to be some mistake," I said again, though the certainty in Jake's voice made it clear he'd already verified the information thoroughly. I'm a nurse at a county hospital. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment and drive a 10-year-old Honda. People like me don't own places like this. Jake's expression was patient but firm. Mrs. Chen, I've been managing this property for 3 years. I know every detail of its ownership history, financial obligations, and legal status. The trust was established by Whitmore and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. They don't make mistakes with documentation of this magnitude. Whitmore and Associates. The name meant nothing to me, but something about Jake's tone suggested it should. I was about to ask for more details when a commotion from the reception hall caught our attention. Through the open doorway, I could see guests gathering around the head table, and the band leader was tapping on his microphone to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please," the band leader announced. "We have a very special recognition to make this evening, as is tradition here at Grandview Estate Gardens." Jake stood up quickly, checking his watch. "Mrs. Chen, I'm sorry, but this is happening now. According to our standard protocol, we always acknowledge the property owner during significant celebrations. It's part of what makes events here memorable." "Wait," I said, panic rising in my voice. "You can't announce this now, not like this. Emma doesn't know, Margaret doesn't know, nobody knows. This will ruin everything." But even as I spoke, I could see Jake's dilemma. He was clearly following established procedures, and the announcement was already underway. The band leader continued speaking, his voice carrying clearly through the reception hall. "Tonight, we have the rare pleasure of hosting a celebration where the property owner is actually present as a guest. It's my honor to recognize the woman, whose generosity and vision make magical evenings like this possible." I felt frozen in my chair, unable to move forward or flee. Through the doorway, I could see Emma and David looking confused, while Margaret's face showed polite interest, mixed with curiosity. She had no idea that her careful social orchestration was about to be completely upended. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in acknowledging Mrs. Lisa Chen, owner of Grandview Estate Gardens and mother of our beautiful bride." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the exact moment when the words registered with the wedding guests, watched as heads turned to search for me, saw Emma's expression shift from confusion to shock to something approaching awe. Margaret's face went through an even more dramatic transformation, from polite attention to disbelief, to what could only be described as horror. Jake offered me his arm. "Mrs. Chen, they're waiting for you." Walking into that reception hall felt like stepping into an alternate reality. Every eye was on me as I moved toward the head table, the same woman who had been relegated to row 4 during the ceremony, who had been treated as an afterthought throughout the evening's festivities. The guests began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm as the magnitude of the situation became clear. Emma stood up from her seat at the head table, her wedding dress rustling as she moved. Her eyes were wide with amazement, and tears were beginning to form. She looked at me as if she were seeing me for the first time, and perhaps in some ways, she was. "Mom?" she said, her voice barely audible over the applause. "Is this real?" I reached the head table and took the microphone the band leader offered me. The weight of it in my hand felt substantial, real in a way that the rest of the evening still didn't. I looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, many not, all of them focused on me with an attention I had never experienced before. "I'm as surprised as all of you are," I said, my voice stronger than I expected it to be. "Until about 10 minutes ago, I had no idea I owned this beautiful place." The crowd murmured with interest, and I could see people leaning toward each other, whispering questions and theories. Margaret remained frozen in her seat, her practiced composure completely shattered for the first time all day. "But," I continued, looking directly at Emma, "what I do know is that there's nowhere else I'd rather be tonight than celebrating my daughter Emma and her new husband David. This place is magical because of the love it holds, and tonight it's holding more love than I ever imagined possible." The applause that followed was genuine and warm, and I felt something shift in the atmosphere of the room. Where before I had been an outsider looking in, now I was standing at the center of the celebration, acknowledged not just as Emma's mother, but as the person who had made this entire evening possible. Emma came around the table and wrapped me in a hug that was fierce and desperate, as if she were trying to anchor herself to this new reality. "Mom, how is this possible?" she whispered in my ear. "I honestly don't know, sweetheart," I whispered back. "But we'll figure it out together." When Emma released me, David approached with the expression of genuine respect and gratitude. "Mrs. Chen, I don't know what to say. This place is incredible. And the fact that it's yours, that you made tonight possible for Emma." He shook his head, seemingly at a loss for words. "You don't need to say anything," I told him. "Just love my daughter the way she deserves. To be loved." The band leader took the microphone back and announced that the dancing would continue, but the energy in the room had fundamentally changed. Guests who had barely acknowledged me earlier were now approaching with congratulations and questions. People wanted to know the story behind the property when I had acquired it, what my plans were for its future. I answered as honestly as I could, explaining that I was just learning about the ownership myself and would need time to understand the full situation. But with each conversation, I felt my confidence growing. These were the same people who had seen me as insignificant just hours earlier, and now they were treating me with the respect and deference typically reserved for someone of substantial means and influence. Margaret had disappeared from the head table, and I caught glimpses of her throughout the evening in intense conversations with various family members. Her carefully constructed social hierarchy had been completely demolished, and she was clearly struggling to recalibrate her understanding of the situation. Grace found me during a quiet moment and pulled me aside, her eyes sparkling with delight and disbelief. "Lisa, this is incredible. Do you have any theories about how this happened?" "None that make any sense," I admitted. "But Grace, I keep thinking about timing. The trust was established 6 months ago, right around the time Emma got engaged. And this venue was Margaret's choice, not mine. What are the odds that she would randomly select a property I apparently owned?" Grace considered this. Either it's the most extraordinary coincidence in history, or someone orchestrated this entire situation. Before I could respond, Jake appeared beside us again, this time carrying a thick folder. "Mrs. Chen, I apologize for interrupting, but I have some additional information that might help explain things." He opened the folder to reveal more legal documents, photographs, and what appeared to be correspondence. "I've been going through our files since our conversation, and I found this letter that was delivered with the original trust documents." He handed me an envelope with my name written in careful script across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message that made my breath catch in my throat. "For Lisa, who gave everything so Emma could have everything. Some gifts take a lifetime to give properly. With love and admiration, E.W." I stared at the initials at the bottom of the letter, my mind racing through memories and possibilities. E.W. The only person I could think of with those initials was Eleanor Whitman, but that was impossible. Eleanor had died 8 months ago, and while we had been close during my early years at the hospital, she couldn't have had the means for something like this. "Jake, do you know anything about Eleanor Whitman?" I asked. His face lit up with recognition. "Eleanor Whitman was the previous owner of this property. She's the one who sold it to the trust that appointed you as the new owner. Did you know her?" The pieces began falling into place with startling clarity. Eleanor Whitman had been the head of nursing when I first started at Riverside General 26 years ago. She had been my mentor, my champion, and eventually my friend. Eleanor had been the one to encourage me to pursue additional certifications, the one who had recommended me for promotions, the one who had listened to my fears about raising Emma alone and assured me that I was stronger than I knew. But Eleanor had also been intensely private about her personal life. She lived modestly, drove an older car, and never displayed any signs of wealth. When she retired 15 years ago, she had simply said she was looking forward to a quiet life of reading and gardening. When she passed away 8 months ago, her funeral had been small and simple, attended mostly by former colleagues who remembered her dedication to nursing and her kindness to younger staff members. "Eleanor owned this place?" I asked, still struggling to process the information. Jake nodded. She purchased it about 20 years ago and had been operating it as a wedding and event venue ever since. She was very hands-on, very particular about maintaining the property's elegance and ensuring that every event held here was special. She always said this place was meant to host life's most important moments. I thought about all the times Eleanor had asked me about Emma over the years, how she had attended Emma's high school graduation even though she was already retired, how she had always seemed to take a special interest in my daughter's achievements and future plans. Eleanor had never married or had children of her own, but she had invested herself in the lives of the people she cared about. "She left me this place," I said, the words feeling strange and wonderful in my mouth. "Eleanor left me this place so Emma could have her dream wedding." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Lisa, that's the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given." As the evening continued, I found myself seeing everything with new eyes. This wasn't just a venue where my daughter was celebrating her wedding. This was Eleanor's final gift to both of us. Every elegant detail, every carefully maintained garden, every sparkling light reflected Eleanor's vision of what special occasions should look like. The irony of Margaret's situation became even more pronounced as the evening progressed. She had chosen this venue specifically because it represented the kind of exclusive, high-end celebration she wanted for her son's wedding. She had paid premium prices for the privilege of hosting the event here, never knowing that every dollar was going to the woman she had been systematically excluding and diminishing throughout the planning process. When I finally encountered Margaret again, it was near the end of the evening as guests were beginning to say their goodbyes. She approached me with the expression that was carefully neutral, though I could see the effort it took to maintain her composure. "Lisa," she said, her voice strained, "I want to apologize for any misunderstandings earlier. I had no idea about your connection to this venue." "There were no misunderstandings, Margaret," I replied calmly. "You made your feelings about my place in this family very clear." Her face flushed slightly. "I think perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. Maybe we could start over, now that we better understand the situation." I looked at this woman who had spent months trying to minimize my importance in my own daughter's life, who had relegated me to the back row of the wedding ceremony, who had attempted to establish her dominance through a dozen small cruelties throughout the day. Now she wanted to start over because my social status had changed in her eyes. "Margaret, my worth as Emma's mother hasn't changed because you found out I own property," I said quietly. "I was the same person an hour ago that I am now. The only thing that's different is your perception." She opened her mouth to respond, but I continued before she could speak. "I raised Emma to be kind, generous, and authentic. She doesn't judge people based on their bank accounts or social status. I hope that as her mother-in-law, you'll try to embody those same values." Margaret's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly. "Of course," she said stiffly. "Emma is a lovely girl." "She's a lovely woman," I corrected. "And she deserves to be surrounded by people who value her for who she is, not what she can do for them." The conversation ended awkwardly, with Margaret retreating to gather her belongings and coordinate the departure of the Rodriguez family contingent. I watched her go, feeling neither triumph nor vindication, just a quiet satisfaction that the truth had finally been revealed. Emma found me as the evening was winding down, still radiant in her wedding dress, but with a new maturity in her eyes that seemed to have developed over the course of the day. "Mom, I need to apologize," she said, taking my hands in hers. I knew Margaret was being difficult, but I didn't realize how badly she was treating you. I should have stood up for you. Sweetheart, this was your wedding day, I said. Your job was to be happy, not to manage other people's behavior. But you're my mom, Emma said, tears threatening to spill over. You've sacrificed everything for me, and I let someone treat you like you didn't matter. I pulled her into another hug, breathing in the scent of her perfume and hairspray and feeling the solid reality of my daughter in my arms. You could. Never let anyone treat me like I don't matter, because you know I matter. That's what gets me through everything else. We stood there together as the last of the guests departed, surrounded by the lingering magic of the evening and the stunning beauty of the venue that was somehow impossibly mine. Jake approached us with a gentle smile, carrying yet another envelope. Mrs. Chen, I have one more thing for you, he said. Eleanor left specific instructions that this should be given to you after tonight's celebration. Inside the envelope was a key attached to a simple keychain and another brief note in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. The gardens need someone who understands that love grows best when it's tended with patience and hope. Thank you for teaching me that through your example. I looked around at the gardens that stretched beyond the reception hall, at the roses that would bloom again next spring, at the rolling hills that provided such a perfect backdrop for life's most important celebrations. This place would continue to host weddings and anniversaries and milestone birthdays, bringing joy to families while providing me with both purpose and financial security I had never dared to imagine. What will you do with all of this? Emma asked, following my gaze across the property. I'm going to take care of it, I said simply. The way Eleanor took care of it, the way she took care of me, the way I took care of you. Love keeps growing when you tend it properly. As we walked toward the parking area where David was waiting to drive Emma to their hotel, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation the day had brought. I had started the morning as a single mother worried about affording a new dress, someone who could be dismissed and relegated to the back row of her own daughter's wedding. I was ending the day as the owner of one of the most beautiful event venues in the region, someone whose generosity had made the entire celebration possible. But more importantly, I was ending the day with a deeper understanding of my own worth and a clearer vision of the legacy I wanted to leave. Eleanor's gift hadn't just given me financial security. It had given me validation that my years of hard work and sacrifice had been seen and valued by someone whose opinion mattered. The drive home to my apartment on Maple Street felt different, even though nothing about the modest building or my small living space had changed. I was still the same person who had gotten dressed there that morning, but I was also somehow more myself than I had been in years. Tomorrow would bring phone calls to lawyers and accountants, decisions about property management and business operations, conversations with Emma about what this all meant for our future. But tonight, I simply sat in my familiar kitchen with a cup of tea, looking at the key Eleanor had left me and thinking about the gardens that were now mine to tend. Some gifts, Eleanor had written, take a lifetime to give properly. I was beginning to understand that the gift wasn't just the property itself, but the opportunity to continue creating beautiful moments for other families, other mothers and daughters, who deserved to feel valued and celebrated. Margaret Rodriguez had spent the day trying to establish that I didn't belong in her world of privilege and status. What she hadn't understood was that I hadn't been trying to join her world at all. I had been building my own world all along, one shift at a time, one sacrifice at a time, one moment of love at a time. Eleanor had simply given me the keys to make that world visible to everyone else. The weeks following Emma's wedding passed, in a blur of phone calls, legal meetings, and revelations that continued to reshape my understanding of Eleanor's extraordinary gift. Whitmore and Associates had scheduled a comprehensive briefing for the Monday after the wedding, and I found myself sitting in their marble-floored conference room, feeling completely out of place among the mahogany furniture and oil paintings of distinguished partners. Attorney Jonathan Whitmore, Eleanor's nephew, as it turned out, was a distinguished man in his 60s who spoke with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to handling complex estates. He spread documents across the polished conference table, like he was laying out pieces of an elaborate puzzle, each one revealing another layer of Eleanor's careful planning. "Mrs. Chen, I must tell you that my aunt spoke of you often over the years," he began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "She considered you one of her greatest success stories, not just professionally but personally. She was enormously proud of what you accomplished as a single mother while maintaining your dedication to nursing." I sat quietly, still struggling to process that Eleanor had thought of me in such terms. To me, she had simply been a mentor and friend, someone who offered guidance and support during my early years at the hospital. I had no idea she had been observing my life so closely, or that she had formed such strong opinions about my character and potential. "The estate Eleanor left you is considerably more complex than just the venue property," Jonathan continued, opening a thick folder. "Grandview Estate Gardens generates substantial annual revenue from weddings, corporate events, and private parties. The business has been profitable for the past 15 years, with Eleanor reinvesting most of the proceeds back into property improvements and maintenance." He handed me a financial statement that made my head spin. The numbers were beyond anything I had ever imagined being associated with my name. Annual revenues in the high six figures, operating expenses that included salaries for a full-time staff of 12 people, maintenance contracts for the gardens and buildings, insurance premiums that cost more than my annual salary at the hospital. Eleanor also established a substantial operating fund to ensure you wouldn't face any immediate financial pressure while learning to manage the business, Jonathan explained. She was quite specific that you should have time to transition gradually, without having to make hasty decisions about your nursing career or Emma's education expenses. Emma's education expenses. Even in death, Eleanor had been thinking about my daughter's future, anticipating needs I hadn't even fully acknowledged yet. Emma had mentioned wanting to pursue a master's degree in education, but I had been quietly worried about how we would manage the costs on top of her existing student loans. Eleanor had apparently been worried about the same thing. "There's also this," Jonathan said, handing me another envelope with my name written in Eleanor's familiar script. "She asked that you receive this only after you'd had time to absorb the initial information about the inheritance." Inside was a longer letter than the previous notes. Several pages of Eleanor's careful handwriting that felt like receiving a final conversation with someone I had deeply respected and cared about. "My dear Lisa," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have survived what I imagine was a rather shocking wedding day. I hope you can forgive an old woman's sense of theater, but I wanted you to understand the gift in the context of celebration rather than grief. By now you know that I have been watching your life unfold with great admiration for many years. You probably think of yourself as someone who simply did what was necessary, but I see you as someone who consistently chose love over convenience, sacrifice over selfishness, and hope over despair." I paused in my reading, feeling tears threatening as Eleanor's voice came through so clearly in her written words. She had always been eloquent, but there was something particularly moving about her final thoughts being directed specifically to me. The letter continued. "When I purchased Grandview Estate 20 years ago, I thought I was simply making a sound investment and creating a beautiful space for important celebrations. But as the years passed, I began to understand that I was really creating something for you, though I didn't fully realize it at the time. Every garden I planted, every renovation I commissioned, every detail I perfected was in preparation for the day when this place would become yours. I watched you struggle to provide Emma with opportunities you never had, and I saw how you maintained your dignity and kindness even when circumstances were difficult. I observed your dedication to your patience, your loyalty to your friends, and your unwavering commitment to being the best mother you could be. These are not common qualities, Lisa, and they deserve to be rewarded in a way that matches their value. The venue has given me great joy over the years, but its greatest purpose will be fulfilled in your hands. You understand what it means to create something beautiful from limited resources, to tend relationships with patience and care, to celebrate love in all its forms. This place needs someone who appreciates that true elegance comes not from expensive decorations, but from authentic emotion. I also confess to a bit of matchmaking from beyond, as you Americans say. I suspected that Emma's future in-laws might be the type of people who judge worth by material possessions rather than character. I wanted to ensure that you would never again find yourself in a position where someone could make you feel small because of your financial circumstances. You were never small, my dear, but now no one can mistake your true stature. The letter went on to provide specific guidance about managing the property, recommendations for staff members I could trust, and suggestions for potential improvements Eleanor had been considering. But it was her final paragraph that moved me most deeply. Please don't think of this as charity or pity, Lisa. This is recognition of value received. You enriched my life immeasurably through your friendship and your example. You showed me what it looked like to live with purpose and integrity, even when it would have been easier to make different choices. This gift is simply my way of ensuring that your goodness continues to create beauty in the world long after I am gone. I set the letter down on the conference table, unable to continue reading through my tears. Jonathan handed me a box of tissues. With the practiced kindness of someone who had witnessed many emotional estate meetings over the years. Eleanor spent 2 years planning every detail of this transfer, he said gently. She consulted with tax attorneys, business managers, and property specialists to ensure the transition would be as smooth as possible for you. She also made arrangements for ongoing support as you learn to manage the business aspects. Over the next several hours, Jonathan walked me through contracts with vendors, employee agreements, insurance policies, and maintenance schedules. The complexity was overwhelming, but Eleanor had anticipated that too. She had arranged for Jake Thompson to continue as venue manager, with increased authority to handle day-to-day operations while I learned the business. She had also contracted with a business consultant who specialized in helping people transition into property management roles. The most important thing to understand, Jonathan emphasized, is that you don't have to make any major decisions immediately. Eleanor structured everything to give you time to adjust and determine what direction you want to take the business. By the time I left the law office that afternoon, my head was spinning with information and possibilities. The practical implications of Eleanor's gift were still sinking in, but the emotional impact was already transforming how I saw myself and my future. For the first time in my adult life, I had choices. Real choices about how to spend my time, where to live, what kind of work to pursue. The drive back to my apartment on Maple Street felt different, as if I were seeing my neighborhood through new eyes. The modest building where I had lived for 8 years suddenly seemed like a temporary stop rather than a permanent destination, not because I was eager to abandon my old life, but because I now had the freedom to choose whether to stay or go based on preference rather than financial necessity. Emma called that evening, her voice bright with excitement and curiosity. She and David were back from their brief honeymoon in Napa Valley, and she was eager to hear about my meeting with the attorneys. "Mom, I still can't believe this is real," she said. "Every time I think about the wedding, about that moment when they announced you owned the venue, I get chills." Margaret's face was absolutely priceless. We both laughed at the memory. Margaret's shock had been so complete, so genuine, that it had almost been comical. The woman who had spent months positioning herself as the superior party in every interaction had been revealed as someone who fundamentally misunderstood the dynamics of the situation. "Have you heard from David's family since the wedding?" I asked. Emma's tone shifted slightly. "Margaret called yesterday to thank us for a lovely celebration. She was very polite, but you could tell she was still processing everything. I think she's embarrassed about how she treated you, even though she's not ready to admit it directly. I wasn't particularly interested in Margaret's embarrassment or potential apologies. The revelation of my ownership hadn't changed my opinion of her character. It had simply revealed it more clearly. A person who could treat someone poorly based on perceived social status would always be someone whose respect was conditional and therefore not particularly valuable. What matters is how you feel about everything, I told Emma. This doesn't change anything between us, you know. I'm still the same person who worried about affording your school clothes and celebrated every A on your report card. I know that, Mom. But it does change some things, doesn't it? You don't have to work double shifts anymore. You don't have to stress about money the way you used to. You have options now. She was right, of course. The financial security Eleanor had provided would fundamentally alter my daily life in ways I was still discovering. But more than the money, it was the validation that felt transformative. Eleanor's letter had shown me that someone I respected had been watching my choices over the years and had deemed them worthy of reward. That kind of recognition from someone whose opinion mattered was worth more than any dollar amount. Over the following weeks, I began spending more time at Grandview Estate Gardens, learning about its operations and getting to know the staff members who had been working there during Eleanor's ownership. They were a dedicated group of people who clearly loved the property and took pride in creating beautiful events for their clients. Rosa Martinez, the head groundskeeper, had been maintaining the gardens for 12 years. She showed me around the property with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a beloved secret, pointing out Eleanor's favorite rose varieties and explaining the seasonal cycles that kept the gardens blooming from spring through fall. Rosa had emigrated from Mexico 15 years earlier and had worked her way up from assistant gardener to head of the entire landscaping operation. Miss Eleanor, she always said this place was meant to make people happy, Rosa told me as we walked through the rose garden where I had found refuge on Emma's wedding day. She wanted every person who came here to feel like they were somewhere special, somewhere beautiful. She cared about the little details that make people smile. I could see Eleanor's attention to detail everywhere Rosa showed me. Hidden benches, positioned to catch the best views, water features placed to create soothing sounds without overwhelming conversation, pathways designed to encourage exploration while ensuring guests never felt lost. Every element had been carefully considered and lovingly maintained. The indoor staff was equally dedicated. Carmen Rodriguez, the catering coordinator who happened to share a name with David's sister, though they were unrelated, had been organizing events at the venue for 8 years. She walked me through the commercial kitchen, the storage areas, the intricate logistics required to serve multi-course dinners to 200 guests, while maintaining Eleanor's standards for presentation and quality. The couples who choose us come back for anniversaries, sometimes their children's weddings, Carmen explained. Miss Eleanor always said we weren't just providing a venue, we were creating memories that would last generations. That's a big responsibility, but it's also what makes this work so meaningful. As I learned more about the business, I began to understand why Eleanor had thought I would be suited to running it. The skills required for managing Grandview Estate Gardens were surprisingly similar to those I had developed as a nurse and single mother. Attention to detail, the ability to remain calm under pressure, skills in coordinating multiple people and processes, genuine care for others' well-being, and the capacity to anticipate needs before they became problems. The more time I spent at the property, the more I could envision myself building a life there. Eleanor had lived in a beautiful apartment above the main office, with windows overlooking the gardens and enough space to feel luxurious without being ostentatious. The apartment had been maintained exactly as she had left it, and Jonathan had explained that it was mine to use or modify as I wished. One evening in late June, about a month after the wedding, I was sitting in Eleanor's former living room, going through business records and trying to understand the seasonal patterns of event bookings. The apartment felt peaceful, filled with comfortable furniture and books and plants that someone had been carefully tending. Through the tall windows, I could see the gardens in their full summer glory, with roses blooming and the fountain catching the last light of the day. My phone rang, and I was surprised to see Grace's name on the caller ID. My sister had returned to Seattle after the wedding, but we had been talking more frequently as I navigated all the changes in my life. "How are you adjusting to being a property mogul?" she asked with characteristic humor. "I'm not sure mogul is the right word, but it's definitely an adjustment," I replied. "Grace, I've been thinking about something and I wanted to run it by you." "I'm listening." "What would you think about moving back to California? Eleanor's apartment here has plenty of space, and I could use help learning to manage this business. Plus, you've been talking about wanting a change from the Seattle school district." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Lisa, are you serious? You want me to come work with you?" "I'm completely serious. You have experience managing complex operations, you're great with people, and you understand the importance of creating positive experiences for families. Besides, I've missed having you nearby." We talked for over an hour about possibilities and logistics. Grace had been considering early retirement from her counseling position, feeling burned out by the increasing demands and decreasing resources in public education. The idea of helping to run a business focused on celebrating life's happy moments appealed to her immensely. "Can I come visit for a week next month?" she asked finally. "I'd like to see the property when it's not in wedding chaos, get a feel for what it would be like to work there." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering twilight, thinking about how my life had expanded in ways I never could have imagined. 6 weeks ago, I had been a single woman living alone in a small apartment, worried about affording Emma's wedding expenses, and wondering what my future would look like as an empty nester. Now I was the owner of a thriving business, living in a beautiful space, with the financial security to make choices based on preference rather than necessity. But more than the material changes, it was the shift in how I saw myself that felt most significant. Eleanor's gift had validated choices I had made over the years, decisions that had sometimes felt like failures or compromises. Working extra, shifts instead of dating, choosing practical over fashionable, prioritizing Emma's needs over my own desires. Eleanor had seen these choices as evidence of character rather than signs of limitation. The next morning brought a call from Jake Thompson with news that would test my new perspective on my role at Grandview Estate Gardens. He had received an inquiry from a prominent local family about hosting their daughter's wedding the following spring. The Rodriguez family wanted to book the venue for Carmen's wedding. "I wanted to check with you before responding," Jake said carefully. "Given the history with Emma's wedding, I thought you might want to handle this personally. Margaret. Rodriguez wanting to book my venue for her daughter's wedding. The irony was almost too perfect. The woman who had treated me as an inconvenience at my own daughter's celebration now needed my permission and cooperation to create the same kind of magical day for her own child. "Schedule a meeting," I told Jake. "I'll handle it personally." The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday afternoon. I spent considerable time preparing, not because I was nervous about seeing Margaret again, but because I wanted to approach the situation with professionalism and grace. Whatever had transpired between us personally, this was a business inquiry from a potential client, and it deserved to be treated as such. Margaret arrived precisely on time, dressed in the same understated elegance she had displayed at Emma's wedding. But something was different about her demeanor. The confident superiority that had characterized all our previous interactions had been replaced by something approaching humility. We met in the main office, with its windows overlooking the gardens where Emma had been married just 2 months earlier. I offered her coffee, which she accepted, and we spent a few minutes discussing the beauty of the property and the perfect weather we had been having. "Mrs. Chen?" Margaret began, her voice more tentative than I had ever heard it. "I want to start by apologizing for my behavior during Emma's wedding planning and celebration. I realize now that I made assumptions and acted in ways that were inappropriate and hurtful." Her apology was unexpected, and it seemed genuine rather than strategic. I listened without interrupting, curious to see where she would take the conversation. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about that evening, about the moment when we all learned about your ownership of this place," she continued. "I realized that my behavior reflected poorly on my character, and more importantly, it was unfair. To you. You deserved better treatment, regardless of what I knew or didn't know about your circumstances." "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "I appreciate the apology." Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, clearly uncomfortable but determined to continue. "I also want you to know that my request to book this venue for Carmen's wedding is not an attempt to repair our relationship through business. If you prefer not to work with our family, I will completely understand and respect that decision." The vulnerability in her statement was striking. This was not the same woman who had orchestrated my seating arrangements or made veiled comments about my place in the family hierarchy. This was someone who had been genuinely humbled by the revelation of her misjudgment. "Tell me about Carmen's vision for her wedding," I said. For the next hour, Margaret described her daughter's hopes. For an intimate celebration focused on family and close friends, Carmen wanted something elegant but not ostentatious, romantic but not overly formal. As Margaret talked about her daughter's preferences and dreams, I could hear genuine love and pride in her voice. Whatever her flaws in dealing with adults, she clearly adored her children and wanted the best for them. "Carmen has always been drawn to gardens and natural beauty," Margaret explained. "When she was little, she used to say she wanted to get married surrounded by flowers. This place would be perfect for her." By the end of our meeting, I had agreed to host Carmen's wedding the following April, not because I had forgiven Margaret's previous behavior, but because I could see that she had learned something from the experience, and because Carmen deserved to have her dream wedding regardless of her mother's past mistakes. As Margaret was preparing to leave, she turned back to me with an expression that was both grateful and slightly bewildered. "Mrs. Chen, may I ask you something personal?" I nodded. "How do you do it? How do you maintain such grace and dignity when someone has treated you poorly?" Most people would have taken satisfaction in turning me away, and it would have been justified. The question gave me pause. I thought about Eleanor's letter, about her observations of my character over the years, about the choices that had led to this moment. "I think grace is something you practice," I said finally. "Like any skill, it gets easier the more you use it. And holding on to anger usually hurts the person carrying it more than the person it's directed toward." Margaret considered this. "Carmen is lucky that her wedding will be in the hands of someone who understands that principle." After she left, I sat in the office for a while, thinking about the circular nature of the situation. Margaret's daughter would be celebrating her wedding at the same venue where Margaret had tried to diminish my importance at my daughter's wedding. But instead of feeling vindicated or superior, I felt hopeful that Carmen's celebration would be everything she dreamed it could be. That evening, I called Emma to tell her about the meeting and the booking. "Margaret apologized?" Emma said with surprise. "They say a mother's love knows no boundaries, but I never imagined mine would be tested at my own daughter's wedding. What started as the most beautiful day of my life quickly turned into a humiliation I'll never forget. Until one announcement changed everything." My name is Lisa Chen, and this is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the people who try to diminish you only reveal their own smallness, while your worth shines brightest when you least expect it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought I'd be the kind of mother who would dread her daughter's wedding day. For 24 years, I had imagined this moment countless times, walking Emma down the aisle, watching her face light up in that dress we'd dreamed about since she was little, sharing tears of joy as she promised her heart to someone worthy of her love. Instead, as I stood in my modest Maple Street apartment that May morning, staring at my reflection in the mirror while buttoning up my navy dress, all I felt was a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. The dress wasn't new. I'd worn it to 3 other weddings over the past 2 years, each time hoping nobody would notice it was the same one. As a registered nurse at Riverside General Hospital, my salary covered our needs, but left little room for luxuries like formal wear I'd only use once or twice. Emma had insisted I didn't need to buy anything special, that she just wanted me there, but I knew her future in-laws would notice. The Rodriguez family noticed everything, especially when it came to what they perceived as shortcomings. I had met Margaret Rodriguez exactly 7 months ago when David first brought Emma home to meet his family. Their house on Hillcrest Drive was everything mine wasn't. Sprawling, immaculate, with carefully manicured gardens and a circular driveway that could fit 4 cars comfortably. Margaret had greeted us at the door wearing what I later learned was a designer blouse that cost more than I made in a week. Her smile was practiced, the kind you perfect for charity galas and business dinners, and her eyes had swept over me, with the efficiency of a scanner, cataloging every detail from my Target cardigan to my sensible nursing shoes. The evening had been pleasant enough on the surface. Robert Rodriguez, David's father, was genuinely warm, asking about my work at the hospital and sharing stories about his own experiences with healthcare during his father's illness. Carmen, David's younger sister, was polite, but distant, clearly, taking cues from her mother about how to treat the woman whose daughter was dating her precious brother. But it was Margaret who set the tone for everything that followed. She had a way of asking questions that sounded interested but felt like interrogations. Where did I go to college? What did Emma's father do for work? Did I own or rent my home? Each question felt designed to establish exactly where I fit in their social hierarchy. And it became clear that in Margaret's mind, I didn't fit anywhere that mattered. When Emma mentioned that I had worked 2 jobs to put her through college, Margaret's response was a thin smile and a comment about how admirable it was that some people were willing to sacrifice so much. The word "some people" stuck with me long after we left that night. It carried the weight of everything Margaret thought about me without having to say it directly. I was some people, the kind who struggled, who couldn't afford the finer things, who worked in scrubs instead of suits. Emma had been furious when I mentioned how the evening made me feel, insisting that her future mother-in-law was just reserved with new people, and that I was reading too much into casual conversation. But the signs were there from the beginning, and they only multiplied as the wedding planning progressed. Margaret had very specific ideas about how her son's wedding should look, and those ideas didn't include much input from the bride's family. When Emma asked if I wanted to help choose the flowers, Margaret had already booked appointments with 3 different florists. When I offered to contribute to the catering costs, Margaret informed me that she'd already put down deposits at 2 venues and would handle all the arrangements. Every suggestion I made was met with a polite smile and an explanation of why what they'd already planned would be better. The guest list became another battleground, though Margaret fought it so subtly that Emma barely noticed. My side of the family was small: my sister Grace, who had flown in from Seattle, my elderly Uncle Frank, and a handful of close friends from work. When I asked Emma how many people I could invite, she told me to invite everyone I wanted. But when Margaret reviewed the final list, suddenly there were concerns about venue capacity and budget constraints. My list was quietly trimmed from 20 people to 12, then to 8. Margaret's explanation was always reasonable, always, delivered with that same practiced smile. But the message was clear. My people mattered less. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 5:30, even though I didn't need to be at the venue until noon. Sleep had been elusive for weeks. My mind, churning with worries about everything that could go wrong. I made coffee and sat at my small kitchen table, looking through the photo album I'd been putting together for Emma. Pictures of her first steps, her graduation from high school, family vacations to places we could afford like camping trips and visits to my sister. Simple moments that meant everything to me, but would probably seem quaint to people accustomed to European vacations and private schools. Emma had spent the night at the hotel near Grandview Estate Gardens with her bridesmaids, following some tradition Margaret had insisted upon about the bride not seeing her family on the morning of the wedding. I understood the sentiment, but it meant I would be getting ready alone, with no one to calm my nerves or help me with my hair. Grace had offered to come over, but she was dealing with her own anxiety about meeting the Rodriguez family for the first time, and I didn't want to burden her with my fears. The venue was exactly as stunning as Margaret had promised. Grandview Estate Gardens sat on 50 acres of rolling hills overlooking the valley, with manicured lawns that seemed to stretch forever and gardens that looked like something from a fairy tale. The main building was a restored Victorian mansion that now served as the reception hall, while the ceremony would take place in a gazebo surrounded by rose bushes that were just beginning to bloom. It was the kind of place I'd driven past countless times over the years, never imagining I'd have reason to go inside. I arrived early, partly because I wanted to help with any last-minute preparations, and partly because I needed time to orient myself in this world that felt so foreign. Sarah Mitchell, the wedding coordinator, was a whirlwind of efficiency, directing vendors and checking details off her clipboard with the precision of a military operation. She greeted me warmly, but I could see she was mentally calculating how much time she could spare for conversation. The first sign of trouble came when I asked Sarah where I should put my purse and whether there was somewhere I could touch up my makeup before the ceremony. She looked confused for a moment, then consulted her clipboard. "Are you part of the wedding party?" she asked. "I'm the mother of the bride," I replied, surprised by the question. Sarah's expression shifted, and she flipped through several pages before finding what she was looking for. "Oh, I'm sorry. I have you down as general seating. Let me check with Mrs." Margaret's smile returned, but it was sharper than before. "Of course she'll always be your daughter, but she's also David's wife now, and that comes with certain responsibilities and expectations. I'm sure you understand." Before I could respond, she swept past me into the restroom, leaving me standing in the hallway with my hands shaking and my mind reeling. The conversation had been brief, but its implications were enormous. Margaret wasn't just trying to minimize my role in today's celebration. She was attempting to establish parameters for my relationship with Emma going forward. I walked slowly back toward the reception, trying to process what had just happened and what it might mean for my future with Emma. The music and laughter felt distant, as if I were watching the celebration through glass rather than being part of it. I paused at the entrance to the reception hall, looking at my daughter dancing with her new husband, both of them glowing with happiness and surrounded by people who clearly adored them. For the first time all day, I seriously considered leaving early. I could make an excuse about not feeling well, congratulate Emma one more time, and slip away before the real drama had a chance to unfold. But as I stood there contemplating my escape, Jake Thompson appeared beside me again, this time carrying what appeared to be an official-looking envelope. "Mrs. Chen, I hate to interrupt your evening, but I have something I need to discuss with you privately. Do you have a moment?" His tone was different from earlier, more serious and professional. I nodded and followed him to a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the music and conversation of the reception. "I need to ask you something, and I apologize if this seems like an odd time," Jake began, holding the envelope carefully. "Are you the Lisa Chen who owns Grandview Estate Gardens?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him in confusion, certain I had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" Jake opened the envelope and pulled out what appeared to be legal documents. According to these ownership papers, a Lisa Chen of Maple Street in Riverside is listed as the primary owner of this property. The transfer was completed 6 months ago through a trust arrangement. I assumed there might be 2 different Lisa Chens, but the address matches, and... He paused, studying my face. "You look like you had no idea." My legs felt unsteady, and I reached for the wall to support myself. "There has to be some mistake. I don't own anything except my apartment." I could never afford a place like this. Jake's expression was gentle but certain. Ma'am, there's no mistake. I've been trying to track down the new owner for months to discuss some operational changes, but the trust arrangement made direct contact difficult. Your name is right here on the deed. He showed me the document, and there it was in black and white. My full name, my address, and legal language that made it clear I was indeed the owner of the very venue where my daughter was celebrating her wedding. It was impossible, surreal, and completely inexplicable. I don't understand, I whispered. How is this possible? Jake folded the papers back into the envelope. I think that's a question for whoever set up the trust. But Mrs. Chen, if you are the owner, there are some things we need to discuss about tonight's event. The implications of what he was saying began to sink in slowly, like water seeping through fabric. If I owned Grandview Estate Gardens, then Margaret hadn't just booked Emma's wedding venue. She had unknowingly booked my property, paid my business, and spent the entire day treating me like an unwelcome guest at my own establishment. What kinds of things do we need to discuss? I asked, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Jake glanced toward the reception hall, where the celebration was continuing in full swing. Well, for starters, someone should probably make an announcement. The staff has been instructed to present a special recognition to the venue owner during tonight's celebration. It's part of our standard wedding package for significant events like this. I felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. An announcement? It's traditional. We announce the owner's presence and their contribution to making the couple's special day possible. Usually it's just a formality, but in this case... Jake paused, clearly realizing the complexity of the situation. I'm glad she did, but I have to admit I'm a little shocked. She's not usually someone who admits to being wrong about anything. People can change, I said. Sometimes it takes a significant event to help them see themselves more clearly. Are you okay with hosting Carmen's wedding? Won't it be weird? I considered her question. It might be a little strange initially, but ultimately it's about creating a beautiful day for a young couple starting their life together. That's always been what this place is for. As summer progressed into fall, I gradually transitioned from full-time nursing to part-time, and eventually to taking a leave of absence from the hospital. The decision wasn't easy. Nursing had been my identity for over 2 decades, and I loved the work and the people I worked with. But I was discovering that managing Grandview Estate Gardens required more time and attention than I had initially anticipated, and I was genuinely enjoying the new challenges it presented. Grace visited in August and fell in love with both the property and the work involved in running it. She gave notice to the Seattle School District and moved to California in September, taking over the apartment above mine and bringing an energy and enthusiasm that enhanced every aspect of the business. I feel like we're playing house, but with the most beautiful dollhouse in the world, she told me one evening as we sat on her balcony, looking out over the gardens. Working with Grace reminded me of our childhood, when we had been partners, in every adventure and defenders of each other against the world. Having her nearby as I navigated this new chapter of my life felt like a gift almost as significant as Eleanor's original bequest. The fall wedding season was busier than I had expected, with events almost every weekend from September through November. Each celebration taught me something new about the business, about managing staff and vendors, about the thousands of details that had to coordinate perfectly to create magical experiences for couples and their families. But it was also teaching me about myself. I discovered that I had a natural talent for understanding what couples truly wanted versus what they thought they should want. I could help nervous mothers of the bride focus on what really mattered, and I could diplomatically redirect families whose expectations didn't match their budgets or their daughter's actual preferences. One October afternoon, I was in the rose garden with Rosa, planning which varieties to add for next year's growing season, when Jake approached with a concerned expression. "Mrs. Chen, I have something I need to discuss with you," he said. We've received an inquiry that I'm not sure how to handle. He handed me a letter that had arrived in the morning mail. The letterhead showed it was from a prominent wedding planning company in Los Angeles, and the content explained that they represented a celebrity couple who wanted to book Grandview Estate Gardens for their wedding the following June. The letter outlined their requirements: complete privacy, extensive security arrangements, media restrictions, and a guest list of over 400 people. They were offering to pay triple our normal rates for exclusive use of the property for an entire weekend. This could be incredibly lucrative, Jake said, but it would also fundamentally change the character of what we do here. Eleanor always kept the focus on intimate celebrations, and this would be more like a production than a wedding. I read through the requirements again, thinking about Eleanor's vision for the property and her hopes for how it would be used under my ownership. The financial opportunity was significant, but something about the proposal felt wrong for Grandview Estate Gardens. "What do you think Eleanor would have done?" I asked Jake. He smiled. Eleanor would have politely declined and recommended a venue better suited to their needs. Then that's what we'll do, I decided. This place is about creating authentic celebrations, not media events. As I was drafting our response to the wedding planners, I realized that I had just made my first major decision as a business owner based on values rather than profit. It felt like a milestone, a sign that I was beginning to understand not just the mechanics of running the venue, but its deeper purpose. The approach of Carmen Rodriguez's wedding in April brought an interesting test of how much both Margaret and I had changed since Emma's celebration. Margaret was involved in the planning process, but in a completely different way than she had been for Emma's wedding. She deferred to Carmen's preferences, consulted with me respectfully about logistics, and treated every interaction as a collaboration rather than a negotiation for control. Carmen herself was delightful to work with, a young woman with clear ideas about what she wanted, but also flexibility about how to achieve it. She reminded me of Emma in some ways, enthusiastic and grateful for every detail that came together to create her perfect day. The night before Carmen's wedding, Margaret called me at home, something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. "Lisa, I wanted to thank you again for making this possible for Carmen," she said. "Everything looks absolutely perfect, and I know tomorrow will be exactly what she dreamed of." "Carmen made it easy," I replied. "She knew what would make her happy, and she trusted us to help her achieve it." There was a pause before Margaret spoke again. "I've learned a lot from watching how you approach this work. You have a gift for understanding what really matters to people." Carmen's wedding day was indeed perfect, blessed with ideal weather and filled with genuine joy. Watching her marry her longtime boyfriend surrounded by the gardens in full spring bloom, I felt the same satisfaction I had experienced at dozens of other celebrations over the past year. This was what Eleanor had envisioned when she created this place, a setting where love could be celebrated authentically and beautifully. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Margaret found me in the office, finalizing details with the catering staff. "Lisa, I have something for you," she said, handing me an envelope. "It's from Carmen, but I wanted to add my own note as well." Inside was a thank you card from Carmen, filled with gratitude for making her wedding day magical. But attached to it was a handwritten note from Margaret that surprised me with its thoughtfulness and sincerity. "Lisa," the note read, "I will never forget the lesson you taught me about grace and dignity. Watching you turn my daughter's wedding into something beautiful despite how I treated you has been one of the most humbling experiences of my life. You could have been petty or vindictive, and it would have been understandable. Instead, you chose to be generous and professional. That kind of character is rare, and I'm grateful Carmen got to experience it firsthand. Thank you for showing me what real class looks like." As I stood in the quiet venue after everyone had gone home, looking out at the gardens bathed in moonlight, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I had been dreading Emma's wedding, worried about fitting in and affording my role in the celebration. Now I was the owner of the most beautiful event venue in the region, working alongside my sister, creating magical experiences for couples and families every weekend. But more than the external changes, it was the internal transformation that felt most significant. Eleanor's gift had given me more than financial security. It had given me a new understanding of my own worth and capabilities. I was no longer the woman who accepted being seated in row 4 at her own daughter's wedding. I was someone who could turn even that experience into something meaningful and transformative. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway caught my attention, and I looked out to see Emma and David's car pulling up to the main building. They had attended Carmen's wedding as guests, and I was surprised to see them returning so late. Emma came through the front door with her characteristic energy, still wearing her wedding guest attire but with her shoes in her hand and a tired but happy expression on her face. "Mom, the wedding was absolutely beautiful," she said, giving me a hug. Carmen looked radiant, and everything was perfect. "You've really found your calling with this place." David nodded in agreement. "Mrs. Chen, the transformation you've created here over the past year is remarkable. Eleanor would be so proud of what you've accomplished." We sat together in the comfortable chairs by the windows, talking about the day's celebration and the changes the past year had brought to all our lives. Emma was thriving in her teaching position. David had been promoted at his law firm, and they were talking about starting a family in the next few years. "I have news," Emma said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "David and I have been talking, and we'd like to book Grandview Estate Gardens for our first anniversary celebration next year. Nothing huge, just close family and friends, but we want to come back to where it all started." The idea of hosting Emma and David's anniversary at the venue where their wedding had revealed so many truths felt like completing a circle. It would be a celebration of their marriage, but also of the journey that had brought our family to this new understanding of itself. "I think that sounds perfect," I said. "Eleanor would love knowing that couples are choosing to come back here for their milestone celebrations." As Emma and David prepared to leave, Emma turned back to me with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, do you ever wonder what would have happened if Eleanor hadn't left you this place? If you had just stayed a nurse and never discovered this whole other side of yourself?" I considered her question carefully. "I think I would have been fine," I said finally. "I was always capable of more than I realized. I just needed the right circumstances to discover it. Eleanor didn't change who I was. She just gave me the opportunity to become who I was meant to be." After they drove away, I walked through the venue one more time, turning off lights and checking that everything was secure for the night. The gardens were peaceful in the darkness, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the gentle sound of water moving through the fountain. In the apartment upstairs, I sat at Eleanor's former desk, now mine, and opened the drawer where I kept her letters. I reread her words about watching my life unfold with admiration, about seeing choices I thought were simply necessary as evidence of character worthy of reward. Eleanor had been right about many things, but perhaps most importantly, she had been right about the power of recognizing and rewarding goodness. Her gift to me hadn't just changed my circumstances. It had rippled outward to affect Emma's confidence, David's respect, Margaret's self-awareness, and Grace's willingness to take risks on new adventures. The venue would continue to host celebrations, creating beautiful memories for families while providing me with purpose and security. But its greatest gift might be the lesson it had taught everyone who witnessed its revelation: that worth isn't determined by external circumstances, and that sometimes the people we overlook or underestimate are the ones who deserve our highest respect. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about tomorrow's schedule. Grace and I would spend the morning reviewing vendor contracts, the afternoon meeting with a couple planning their fall wedding, and the evening having dinner together while planning our next improvements to the property. It was a life I couldn't have imagined a year ago, but one that felt absolutely right now that I was living it. Eleanor had given me more than a business or a home. She had given me the chance to discover that grace under pressure, love despite difficulties, and hope through challenges weren't just survival strategies, but the foundations of a life worth celebrating. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.